Glory Cloud Podcast, Episode 19. Well, stay tuned, everyone. We're going to do something a little different this week. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Glory Cloud Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Cahy, and Lee and I decided that during this holiday season, we'd like a little bit of time off. Hope you don't mind that. But in order to continue to give you good biblical theological content, we thought that what we would do is play a lecture from Meredith Kline from when he taught at Westminster Seminary, California. And I tried to think of a lecture where he mentioned the Incarnation, since this is the time of year when we remember the Incarnation. Not that God changed, but that the second person of the Trinity took a human nature to himself in order to become one of us and to save us from our sins. And so this lecture is from March 4th, 1999. Hope that you enjoy it.
And so the gap theory, as it has been known, alleges that the first verse in Genesis 1 would have been a statement of the original creation of the world. And then by the time you come to verse 2 and it speaks about the earth in a somewhat inchoate, if not chaotic state, it is felt that couldn't be the result of God's original work. That couldn't be the way the world would come from God's direct creative hand. Something must have happened. And so the first verse, they feel, describes the original creation. And we don't know anything more so much about that, but something happened. And here they would then try to work in as an explanation for this gap and the chaos that seems to overtake God's creation, the fall of Satan. And so then they will be appealing to certain passages in the prophets, perhaps like Isaiah 14 or Ezekiel 28, which are supposed then to be stories of the fall of Satan, which they inject there, or between verses 1 and 2. It's not there, but they suppose it's there. They intrude it there from what they think they find elsewhere. And then we come to verse 2, and now the story picks up in the situation that's been made a mess by the fact that Satan has fallen and introduced this disturbance into the creation, so that what we have and what we've been interpreting as the original creation of the world, the revelation of the power and the wisdom of God and so on, and it becomes the story of the recreation of the world, or the reordering of the world after it had fallen into. That's the view. And I would think that some of you at least are familiar with it, and so I thought necessary at least to mention it, and we can't take the time to be criticizing the thing in detail. I don't think there's anything much that can be said for the passages that are appealed to in the prophets, as supposedly pointing to that dubious and clearly the first chapter of Genesis is treated according to the analogy of Scripture elsewhere, not as God's attempt to restore something after the fallen into a disrepair and chaos, but it's the story of the exercise of a sovereign divine wisdom and power, which the Psalms and so on celebrate all the evidence of God's goodness. That this is the original creation, not the restoration. So there is that view there. I hope none of you will feel any discussion presented in this behalf is really worthwhile. Another form of the gap view. You're perhaps familiar with Bruce, his first name Waltke, why his name doesn't sound right all the time. Bruce Waltke, he teaches at Regents. He's lectured and delivered courses here. He taught for some years in Philadelphia. And, he's a fine Hebrew scholar. And I remember in the days when he was still a dispensationalist down in connection with Dallas many years ago, and we had correspondence at that time. trying at that time to talk him out of his dispensationalism and to get him into covenant theology. I didn't hear anything much. Our correspondence came to a certain point. He didn't respond. And I thought he got nowhere. And then some years later, all of a sudden, I hear he's been appointed to teach Old Testament in Westminster, Philadelphia. So I feel, wow, something's happened here. And so that's been his history since. But on this particular subject, he's come up with a rather novel form of the gap view. He sees that the usual form won't do. And on his analysis grammatically of the first verse, he, instead of taking it as an independent statement, as we did in class here, he somehow subordinates it to what follows, and he feels the same way that what follows has to do with a world that has somehow fallen into this unhappy condition, and he inserts then the original history back before verse 1, not between verses 1 and 2, but he supposes that is something before verse 1, which the Bible then doesn't explicitly deal with, and I find that an even stranger view than the usual gap view, but if you encounter it, then you won't be taken completely by surprise. So there are other views, and maybe some that I haven't mentioned, some variations on all of these. But that will do. Now returning to our advocacy of the framework view, what we are trying to show then, by kind of a positive exposition at the same time of Genesis 1, and as I said, let's try to be doing that and not just dealing with this polemics of the creation business, but we're trying to get out of Genesis 1 with big theological messages and the eschatological patterns and so on that are developing in here. And so as we do that, we had already, I guess, put on the board the upper-lower register analysis of the sequence of the days, and we had said that in verse 1 then we had heaven, upper register, the lower register, these two terms we've discussed at some length, and the meaning of heaven, and argued that it refers to the invisible heavens, which is what upper register refers to the invisible realm where God is enthroned with his angels and so on. Whereas earth refers to the whole visible cosmos, to the earth beneath. And just to fill out the thing and then come back, we're going to then also say, as you recall, that in verses 3 and following, through verse 31, the end of the chapter, which is the account of what God was doing during these 6 days, we have the upper register coming to expression in the let there be's, the finites. So the executive word of God goes forth, and then his will is performed on earth, and we have fulfillment. Let there be light, and there was light. Upper register, the decree goes forth from the throne of God. Lower register, the sovereign, omnipotent results effected in the development of the cosmos correspondingly. And then finally, in chapter 2, 1 through 3, we come to God's seventh day. It's the Sabbath. And definitely that's the upper register. God rested on the Sabbath day. He assumed his heavenly throne as the king over the world. That's what the concept of the divine Sabbath rest involves then, is an enthronement over the cosmos up there. And then the earthly counterpart to it, the ordinance of the Sabbath, is the Sabbath reality replicated for human observance in the lower register. So that's the overall pattern. And then just to fill it out and to do so, I'll read a bit from appropriate pages here in my article concerning now Genesis 1 verse 2, the concept that spirit stands for the heavenly reality. Might not seem to be obvious, but given the biblical data, I think this is where we end up. Genesis 1:2, both invisible and visible space introduced in Genesis 1:1 as the heavens and the earth respectively appear again here in verse 2. Focusing on the lower register, this verse describes the earth as in this early inchoate state, but it also prepares for the following account of how this uninhabitable world, without form and void, unfilled, uninhabitable, how that then also was transformed into a paradise-like home for man. And it does so by pointing to the God of the invisible heaven present above the darkness and shrouded waters of the earth below. How does this mess get transformed into a paradise home for God? It looks so unpromising there that deep in the darkness, well, look who's there, hovering over the thing, God himself. And God, who is the almighty power to transform chaos into cosmos, God, the God of heaven, and the God of the heavenly temple, the God who is the heavenly temple, and who as such is the paradigm for what is happening on the earth beneath. He who has made that heavenly temple, which is a paradise, will be able then, as he functions here, to transform the earthly situation into a replica of the heavenly, so that man's home, man, the image bearer of God, will find himself like the Lord himself in a paradise, in a temple, and in a sanctuary in Eden. And so it is the presence of the Spirit over the waters, hovering, merahepet, hovering over the waters, that gives promise of the happy developments that will be pursued through the rest of these days. This creative spirit presence is depicted in avian metaphor, in bird-like imagery. Hovering over is the term, as we said, that is used there, as hovering in fostering fashion above the world, just as a bird would protectively canopy over, fluttering the wings over her young ones. This is the picture then of the Creator's protective watch care, hovering over the creation to bring it along to its proper conclusion. Now, the word spirit, is that the right word for this heavenly reality? Well, as shown, for one thing, by the striking echo of Genesis 1:2 and Deuteronomy 32, 10, 11. We want to look at that now. In Deuteronomy 32, verse 10, 11, the Spirit here in Genesis 1:2 does refer to that heavenly epiphany, which is known in its manifestation within the visible world as the Shekinah, the theophanic cloud of glory. All right, what is our thesis here? What we are contending then is, well, let's turn to Deuteronomy 32 and verses 10 and 11. And this is Moses' song of witness against the Israelites. He reminds them of all that the Lord has done for them. As we study the covenants, we'll be seeing, of course, that this is how the covenant treaties begin early on with reminders to the covenant people of all that the good Lord has done for them and establishing them as his people and so on, and how he has been faithful. And then it goes on to describe what their duties were and obligations, and in a text like Deuteronomy 32, which is already something of a lawsuit witness against Israel for breaking the covenant, it will remind them of that although the Lord has been so faithful, that they have been unfaithful, they have broken the covenant, and therefore they are in danger of the covenant sanctions, the curse overtaking and so on. Well, that's the pattern of things. Now then, within Deuteronomy 32, at this point, we are in that first stage where we are establishing the faithfulness of the Lord, what he has done for Israel, as he called them out of Egypt, and he led them through the wilderness, ultimately to the promised land, which he dispossessed for them, and so on. Now, as you recall, the way this is narrated, let's say, in the book of Exodus, you remember specifically how it was that the Lord led them, what form God's presence took during the Exodus. It was, of course, at that point that you encounter the phenomenon of that cloud of glory, that cloud which would become luminous and lead them through the darkness of the night. It assumed various forms. You will be wanting to study this concept in some detail presently. It assumed various forms. It can be this cloudy overshadowing thing to protect them from the heat of the day. It could be the luminous thing, as we said, by night, a pillar of cloud and fire leading them through it assumes various forms, and it was specifically that, visibly, that's what Israel saw. That was the form of God that they saw leading them through the desert. Now then, in the book of Deuteronomy here through 32, Moses is retelling that story, and as he does so, he pictures this Exodus redemptive work of God as a new creation event. And that, of course, is very common in the Bible. The whole story of redemption is told in the Bible as a work of recreation, and ultimately leading to a new heaven and a new earth. And so as Moses then is portraying this Exodus redemptive work of the Lord as a recreation, he does so by describing what God was doing on that occasion in terms of what he did on the original creation. In Deuteronomy 32, 10 and 11, he picks up the imagery of Genesis 1, verse 2. And what is particularly striking then is that there are two words that are used in Genesis 1, 2, and in Deuteronomy 32, 10 and 11. And here only, I guess, in all of the Pentateuch, the only places where these two words appear. And the one is, we call it the Hebrew. The Hebrew speaks about the tohu abohu, the chaotic thing, the tohu. That word appears in Genesis 1, 2, and that appears in Deuteronomy 32 in the form of, he says, where did I find you? God says to Israel, where did I find you? What was the condition that you were in when I found you? Of course, he's trying to point out that they were lost and undone and had nothing going for them, and it was only by his sovereign grace and power that, of course, anything could be accomplished. And so he says to them that he found them there in that waste, howling wilderness. It's often translated in a desert land, verse 10. In a desert land, he found them in a barren and howling waste, and that's there. And then when you pick up this word from Genesis 1, 2, that the world was just a tohu there until the Spirit got working on it. And then he goes on, he shielded him and cared for him. He guarded him as the apple of his eye, like an eagle that stirs up its nest. And now we get the verb that was used in Genesis 1, 2 with the Spirit, Meredith, hovering over the deep, and Moses uses that term here to describe what was happening. He shielded and cared for him like an eagle that stirs up its nest, that spreads and hovers over its young, that spreads its wings to catch them and carries them on its pinions. The Lord alone led him, no foreign God was with him. So here, Genesis 1, 2 provides the image for the reality of what God was doing in the Exodus, and the historical reality we know is that there was the glory cloud was the actual thing that hovered over them, and so the net result of this is that Spirit, in terms of upper register, is the equivalent of this phenomenon. Well, here we are down later in history at the Exodus. The upper register broke into lower register experience in the form of the glory cloud. The Shekinah that leads them, which when the tabernacle is built, fills the tabernacle, which when the temple is built, still later on in history, fills the temple. The glory cloud being the equivalent then of the glory that Isaiah, for example, in Isaiah, when he's up in the upper register and he sees what's going on there, and he sees the glory of God fills the whole temple up there. So that is the divine glory of heaven. And it is invisible to us, but along the way of Israel's history, God makes it visible after a fashion in a miniaturized form that crosses over the threshold of invisibility into the visible realm of human experience. It appears then in the form of a glory cloud. So there is the equivalency then of this theophany. Now here we have that on earth. Here is a manifestation of God on earth, and it is the equivalent of the divine glory that is up there in heaven. Now as we go on and develop this concept at some length, we'll be showing that the biblical usage is to identify this particular theophany with the third person of the Trinity, the Spirit. The second person of the Trinity becomes manifest in earthly history in Old Testament times in the angel of the Lord, which, by the way, was very closely bonded with the glory Spirit. The second and the third persons of the Trinity, each having a form of earthly manifestation that were very close and coordinated with one another. And so the Spirit is the particular person of the Trinity who is manifested in this particular phenomenon. We'll be showing that at length. But now here we have another one. And Genesis 1 verse 2 is the original, as we've just been showing. It's Deuteronomy 32 with a parallelism, talking about this phenomenon of the glory cloud, and as that which was hovering over Israel in the recreation. It tells us then that Spirit is a term for that. The same, the third person of the Trinity there again is a term for that in the original creation story. So the glory, this manifestation of the third person of the Trinity involves a big subject. I'm not going to get into it at any length now, but we talked about trying to develop a biblical cosmology. When we talk about the first verse, and we were talking about the invisible heavens and what that is like and so on. And of course it is the place of the revelation of God's glory. And invisible to us, but there it is, those dimensions of the divine glory that we cannot see, that there they are. And what I think is emerging, at least in my own thinking here, is that we have a phenomenon here. It's connected, you see, when it appears on earth, it's identified with the third person of the Trinity, with the Spirit. And so the equivalent up there in heaven, this revelation of God's glory that fills the heavens, I think is to be related especially to the third person of the Trinity. That there is a manifestation of the third person of the Trinity that takes place at the creation of the world here in Genesis 1:1. When this happens, heaven is produced, and heaven is structured, it is filled by this glory, which is the Spirit. And what that adds up to, this is running past it very fast here, and it's something for us all to investigate and to pursue further. But what is happening here then is that the third person of the Trinity has just taken on a form of revelation within creation, which is identifiable with the very structure of heaven, because this glory fills the heaven, It creates its whole atmosphere. It creates its shape. It constitutes the heavens architecturally, you might say. And this is, we might say, an embodiment of the Holy Spirit. And what we, of course, led to very rapidly as we pursue this line of thought is a parallel between the second person of the Trinity, who becomes embodied in the Incarnation in a permanent form of manifestation of himself as the second person of the Trinity. And that's what we in theology have recognized hitherto. What I'm suggesting is that there's a similar truth with respect to the third person of the Trinity that in our theology we haven't recognized to this point, but that we should. And we need a name for it. This third person of the Trinity coming to expression as the glory which constitutes the heavens which are forever, which will never pass away. This is not just some passing theophany that it appears and it's transient and disappears. No, heaven, this glory of heaven, this embodiment of the Holy Spirit, which is heaven, is something which is forever. In other words, then, here is a permanent, all right, I say we might call it an embodiment, but that sounds too much like incarnation in a body. And so looking for another term, felt I had to coin one. So working from the idea of glory and doxa, I said that this was not incarnation, but this was endoxation. And it is a taking on of a permanent manifestation form within creation, of course, of the Spirit, just as the Incarnation was the same. So this is not a phenomenon that stands back of history and apart from creation and so on. This is God, the Trinity, coming to glorious self-manifestation within history. And had there never been an incarnation, had there never been a fall, had there never been a need for Christ, the second person of the Trinity, to come into history, had there never been that, there still would have been this phenomenon of God's revealing His glory, embodying Himself in this particular form of glory in history, the thing that constitutes heaven as His glory temple. And it is the revelation of His glory, the manifestation of His power, the manifestation of His wisdom. And because this endoxation, this spirit structure, is a temple structure, and the temple is the place which God has prepared for us, where He tabernacles over us forever. This is the ultimate goal of that Christ achieved redemptively, but it was the goal that God had in view from the very beginning. Had there even never been sin, this would have been the consummation of history for Adam and Eve and those coming from it, to make their way through lower register history and to arrive there in this heavenly glory, where God would tabernacle over them, where they would dwell in the courts forever, where they would be in the bosom of the Lord. In other words, this very way in which God creates the world as a revelation of Himself, as a heavenly temple to which He is inviting and gathering His people, is a wonderful expression of the love of God right from the beginning within creation. Yes, the love of God is so easy to apprehend in His gracious dealings with us after the fall and in Christ's salvation and so on. But here already we have a thought of the intimacy that the Lord was ready to be involved with His creatures, and it was for this purpose that He created them, to glorify Him, but also to enjoy Him and to gather to His bosom within His temple. And this, I think, these are some of the implications of what we're trying to say. And this then is the Spirit that is mentioned as present in Genesis 1, verse 2. The heavenly glory temple hovering over the world, and giving great promise, therefore, that the world is going to develop in this way, so that the whole world, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool, would be one great cosmic temple. So they're just the most fundamental features of a biblical doctrine of creation and eschatology and theology are all bound up in here. And so I say, what a pity that we get lost with the insignificant detail of how long the days were. But what a pity. And when these are the things that should be filling our souls and our minds with adoration, thanks to God that are really being revealed in this chapter. Well, moving ahead then, although as I say, this is something then that we will be coming back to more than once, and especially as we get into the story of man as being created here in the image of God. And once again, just as right now I was maintaining that the glory spirit, who is the heavenly temple, is the paradigm and the model as God creates the world below. Once again, I think the biblical evidence indicates that when God says, let us make man in our own image and so forth, that is precisely referring to this phenomenon as known on earth in the form of the glory cloud. It is precisely pointing to that point of reference that God says, now let us make man in our image. The likeness of God in which we are made as individuals is also this glory spirit. So that not just the natural world is a temple made in that likeness, but we as individuals being made in the likeness of the heavenly temple, we as individuals are temples of God. And corporately, as we are embodied into one body in Christ, are a corporate temple, because we as human beings are made in the likeness of the Spirit, who is the heavenly temple of God, and other things then also follow from that in detail about what constitutes the imago Dei in man. Now then, days 1 through 6 here, we're saying here again, we continue to have upper register and lower register. The fiats, let there be, directing our thoughts to the throne, and the sovereign king and judge who sits there and issues his decrees in the midst of his heavenly council and so forth. And let's see where I want to read here, page 9. It says, the several creative fiats by which visible space gets fashioned into a habitable world in the course of the 6 days are sovereign decrees. They clearly evoke the throne of the King of Glory, the King invisible, the only God, dwelling in light unapproachable. The divine let there be, the divine fiat, takes the consultative form, let us form. The consultative form that reveals the setting to be the angelic council. God on his throne, surrounded by the angels of the heavenly court, the divine council. The judicial assembly, which is a regular feature in disclosures of the heavenly reality, which was called heaven in verse 1, which is called spirit in verse 2, the upper register, as we're calling it. Now there again, I'll save the discussion and defense of the contention that let us refers not to inter-Trinitarian personal relationships, but rather to the relationship of God to the divine council of angels, who in his condescension God takes into deliberation with himself. And it's a picture that is confirmed by other examples. And in the Bible, it might surprise us, that God would condescend to be setting on a course of action, not just making up his own mind as it were and going ahead, but calling upon the angels to have their input into the whole thing. And yet, lo and behold, that is the kind of thing we see going on elsewhere in the Bible, and it needn't surprise us that that's what's going on here, especially since everywhere that this consultative plural appears, and it only appears a half a dozen times in the Bible, but every time it does appear, it is referring to angels. The angels are always there when this expression appears. The cherubim are there, the angels are there, but it's God talking every time. to his angels. And so I'm saying that all of the fiats evoke the heavenly scene, but most of all, this one, let us, because it brings even into view the angels who are surrounding God up there. Another index of the continued inclusion of the heavenly register in the scene in these 6 days here is the motif of divine surveillance. Not just the sovereign words that go out from the mouth of God, bring us up into heaven, but the picture that God is looking around down at what he has done, and he is pronouncing verdicts upon it. So there's the theme of God's surveillance, as I say, his eyes looking down at the work, and that leads him presently to a judgment. The motif of the divine surveillance and judgment, which is found in the refrain, and God saw that it was good. So there's one of those repeated things each day. God engages in this surveillance, this survey, this review of what he has done, and God saw, and he pronounces the judgment that it was good. Repeatedly conjoined with statements that the invisible heaven is the site of God's temple throne elsewhere in the Bible, is the declaration that from his heavenly throne, he engages in a judicial scrutiny of the world. That's a common theme in the Psalms and the prophets. That's the picture of God sitting up there and seeing what people are doing on earth, what the nations are doing, what the cities of man are doing, and then he responds appropriately, especially if the things call for judgment or if it calls for the deliverance of his people. But he is constantly engaged as the one who is judge of all the earth, with a very effective surveillance of all that is going on below. From that throne, according to Psalm 11, his eyes behold, his pupils try the sons of men. So the Lord is peering down all the time, seeing into all places, and we are reminded, that the night is as the day before him, and you can't hide in the darkness. His surveillance is all effective. It was from his throne in heaven that the divine master builder looked down and saw the unfolding work of his hands and pronounced it good. That is in perfect accord with his architectonic plan. Further, the full two-register cosmology comes to expression in the fiat fulfillment format, which is the basic structure of each of the 6-day stanzas. While the let there be is uttered at the upper level, the and it was so transpires at the lower level. The fiat of the logos word above is executed by the Spirit in the earth beneath. Okay, that may suffice then to show how the two-register thing, and especially how the upper register continues to be present, and not just present but dominant. I hope you can see then that the dominant perspective of the creation story is from God's point of view. He is the hero. He is the big subject, capital S, of the creation story. He is the creator. He is the one of whom are all things, and unto whom are all things, and that shouldn't be missed. Well, then, moving on to the Sabbath theme, the seventh day. Let's see what we have here. I have the wrong page listed for this, but I guess it doesn't take much thinking, of course, to recognize here that once again, when we come to the Sabbath day, that is talking about the upper register, as I said in even the original outline, as I put that on the board. The Sabbath consists precisely in the fact that God takes his throne, his Sabbath rest. The very verb to sit and thus to rest in the scripture has the pregnant meaning of enthronement. In the case of the king, he takes his seat, he engages in a royal session, a royal reign. It's a coronation, it's an enthronement episode, and on God's part, that clearly then has to do with the heavenly reality up there. And of course, the lower reality is also represented by the ordinance of the Sabbath. So far we have now the Sabbath brings us sort of into temporal categories as well as spatial. Our analysis up to this point was in terms of the cosmos viewed from the space coordinate, but there are the both space and time coordinates in this. And what we want to do now is to look at the time coordinate, which is already present in the idea of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is both a space, it's the heavenly throne chamber, but it's also a time concept to get welded together, and it's the concept of an eternally extending seventh day of the Lord, as we argued. And now let me find the pages in this thing that okay. Upper register time. Lower register time is described in the course of the days. On lower register time is the phenomenon that are produced by the relation of the earth to the sun and the moon and the stars, and it's that kind of relationship that establishes and calibrates the measurements of time. It's the way we experience time on Earth, is in terms of these solar earthly relationships. And so there is that kind of time. And what is said of days 1 and days 4, that God created these luminaries to give light on the day and to measure it and to calibrate it and to separate the light from the darkness and the day from the night. There you have the account of time down here in the stories of day 1 and 4. But the story of time up in heaven is given in the form of a refrain connected with every one of the 6 verses. It is just about the closing refrain. And it was evening, and it was morning, day 1. And it was evening, and it was morning, day 2. That chronology, and that's what we're talking about when we're talking about the days of Genesis, right there. That refrain is the thing that paints the picture of a week of 6 days, with the following 7th. It is that refrain line that gives us the picture of, and as I said earlier on, the literal view is right over against the day-age view, in saying that the picture is that of normal days with their evenings and morning. That certainly is the picture, but now what we are discovering is that picture finds its location up here on the upper register, where we discover then that the picture is not a literal picture, but it must be a metaphor, it must be a figurative picture, because if it has to do with the upper register, has nothing to do with the time as we know it on the lower register, where things are measured by the sun. And time is not measured in God's presence in the angels by the sun's relationship to anything. That is solar time. It's not the time experience of heaven. And yet, the evening and morning day pattern, the picture of the week of 7 days in Genesis 1, is something that describes the heavenly. Now, how to establish that, you see. Here is the account then of that formula. Evening, morning, day, whatever the thing is. How to establish that formula belongs up there as a metaphor and not down here as something literal. Well, you do that, of course, by showing its connection with the other temporal data. Now, as I said, we looked at this from the point of view of space. Now let's look at it from the point of view of the temporal features. And I said that with the Sabbath, we actually had come to one of those. But before that, we had back at the beginning, Bereshit. So in the beginning, what I'm going to argue, of course, is that this evening, morning, day formula gets linked in on the one side to in the beginning, and it gets linked in to the 7th day. Of course, the 6 days. The 6 days get linked into the 7th day on this side. So this formula hooks onto here, there, and it hooks onto the Sabbath here. And both the beginning and the Sabbath have to do with the upper register. They have to do with the divine experience. And therefore, evening and morning day refrain being associated, linked with them, belongs with them on the upper. That's That's the thesis. Now let's see if it becomes any clearer or obscure as I read from here. Upper register time. A, the beginning. As we've observed, the allusions in Proverbs 8, 22 and 23 to the Bereshit of Genesis 1, remember our discussion of that, show that this beginning precedes the situation surveyed in Genesis 1, verse 2. We discussed whether it was a heading, remember? In the beginning was a heading for the whole chapter. We said, no, it isn't that. According to Proverbs 8, wisdom says she was there in the beginning, and the beginning is equated with before any of these activities attributed to page 1 through 6 in Genesis 1. So in the beginning is this, we said, first phase in the creation, including the absolute beginning, the interface between the divine eternity apart from the creation and the space-time continuum, that initial thing beyond our understanding, beyond analysis in terms of the Big Bang is something that just back of the Big Bang. That beginning is there, but also apparently that whole first phase up to the point to which we come in verse 2 where it speaks about the Earth, planet Earth being in a certain condition. So it's in the beginning is not a punctiliar thing. It is durative, all right, but it is back there before Earth history as subsequently described. And now it becomes a question of investigating the Bible to see what are the connotations of the concept in the beginning. Where do we find ourselves when we read about this beginning? And the answer, of course, is we find ourselves up there in the interactivity, as it were, of God himself up there in heaven. It marks the interface of recreation, the space-time continuum, pointing back to what is signified by was in the identification of God as the one who is and who was and who is to come. In Genesis 1:1, the beginning is peculiarly associated with God himself. Likewise, echoes of Bereshit in the beginning in the scriptures focus on divine acts and intra-Trinitarian relationships back of creation, equating the beginning with the stage before the earth was. Proverbs 8:23 asserts that the personified divine wisdom was present with God at the beginning. The prologue of John's Gospel identifies the beginning in terms of the relationship between God and the Logos, who was God and made all things, the one who identifies himself as the beginning of the creation of God and speaks of the glory he had with the Father before the world was. This is the Logos. This is the one who is associated with whom in the beginning is associated. All indicators tell us that in the beginning belongs to that upper register where Father, Son, and Spirit act together in sovereign purpose and word and power to create the world. In the beginning is a time coordinate of invisible space. Entry into the 6 days that it is. That's what in the beginning is. It's our entry into the 6 days. Entry into the 6 days that it is, the beginning serves to identify them as also belonging to the invisible cosmological register up there. Well, that connection serves to put the 6-day formula up there where it belongs in the upper register within the beginning, and then the other end of the thing does the same, the 7th day. God is present at the beginning of creation. He is the beginning, but he's also the end. For he appears at the completion of creation as the Sabbath Lord. The 7th day has to do altogether with God, with the upper register. The divine rest, which characterizes the 7th day as the reign of the finisher of creation, enthroned in the invisible heavens in the midst of the angels, it is precisely the exclusion of man from this heavenly Sabbath of God that gives rise to the 2-register cosmological order. At the consummation, God's people will enter into his royal rest, the 7th day of creation, but until then, Until then, that seventh creation day does not belong to the lower register world of human solar day experience. It is heaven time, not earth time, not a time measured by astronomical science. Not only the identification of the Sabbath rest with God's royal session on high, but the unending nature of the seventh day of creation differentiates it from earthly solar days. And we gave that whole argument appealing to the book of Hebrews chapter 4 to show that in fact that seventh day is an unending day, and therefore it is not a solar day. And so we have developed that. And now then, coming to the 6 days, linked in between, in the beginning, and Sabbath, linked in between these two upper register temporal signs, and connecting them are the 6 days we're talking about. Under consideration then here is the series of these 6 numbered days described in this refrain, this closure signature formula. This refrain is not to be connected with the solar time phenomena of days 1 and 4. It's not confined to those two contexts, but it's included in all 6-day sections, and in every case is immediately conjoined to the numbered day. The imagery of the evening and morning is simply a detail in the creation week picture. The refrain thus functions as the formulaic framework of the account. When we talk about the framework view, the chronological framework, what we're talking about very specifically is this refrain line, this 6 times repeated refrain. It was evening and it was morning. That constitutes the framework. Now the question whether the references to the 6 days with their evenings and mornings describes lower register time phenomena or whether they belong to the upper register is answered in favor of the latter, the upper register, by the interlocking of the 6 days on both sides with upper register temporal features. Certainly the 6 days are part of the same strand as the 7th day. And the beginning, as we've already suggested, is to be taken as the threshold of this creation week. And Psalm 104 has a similar feature. The 6 evening morning days, then, do not mark the passage of time in the lower register sphere. They are not identifiable in terms of solar days, but rather relate to the history of creation at the upper register of the cosmos. The creation week is to be understood then figuratively, not literally. That's the conclusion demanded by the biblical evidence. And then I have why don't I quickly read that, and then we'll take our break. The theme of replication of a register time in earthly time. One of the many replication features that we've been calling attention to, like man created in the image of God, the world created as a likeness of the heavenly temple. Earthly time structured to be a replica of sabbatical heavenly time. Rounding out the series of acts of spatial and temporal replication in the Genesis prologue is the reproduction of the pattern of the Creator's time in the instituting of the Sabbath Ordinance. This ordinance superimposed a special temporal grid on the calendar of days and seasons marked by astronomical sequences. The Sabbath was designed for symbolic purposes within the covenant community as a sign calling to consecration, the imitation of God, and as a seal from God to man, as a seal promising consummation of the kingdom to the covenant keepers. By this promise, the Sabbath reminds us that lower register history as a whole is patterned after upper register time, in that it is consummation directed. It has eschatological movement towards Sabbath. The weekly scheme of the Sabbath Ordinance portrays this overall seventh-day bound design of lower register time, at the same time that it is symbolically mirroring the archetypal heavenly creation week itself. Exodus 20:11 brings out explicitly that the continuing earthly pattern of sabbatical weeks is a human copy of a divine original. Within the two-register cosmology of the creation calendar, all its replications of upper register realities in the lower register world, all of them reproductions with a difference, there can be no doubt about the figurative nature of the relation of the Sabbath Ordinance to God's upper register creation week. The gratuitous insistence of literalists that the terms of the Sabbath Ordinance in Exodus 20:11 demand that the creation week be one of literal solar days is contradicted by the metaphorical character of the whole series of creational replications to which the original Sabbath Ordinance belongs. All of these earthly phenomena are just replications then that provide metaphors, figures of speech, if we want to be describing the upper register phenomena. If we want to describe God, we are pretty much bound up to anthropomorphic terms, because man has been created in the lower register as an image of God, and if we want to refer to God, we use a human-like terms. If we want to refer to God's days up there, time, we have to use our earthly experience. So the Sabbath just gets into that whole pattern. Similarities, but with a difference in each case, not one-to-one relationship. Like man's nature is image of God, man's walk in imitation of God's sabbatical way is not a matter of one-to-one equivalence, but of analogy, of similarity with a difference. Like all the other lower register replicas, the sabbatical week of the ordinance is a likeness to its original, not exactly the same. It is an earthly metaphor for the heavenly archetype. The Genesis prologue thus concludes with the record of the instituting of the lower register phenomenon that provides the figurative chronological framework on which this literary composition has itself been constructed. The 7-day metaphor, God's revelation employed for the time dimension of his own creating of the heavens and the earth. That will have to then suffice to cover that, and if you have other comments or criticism or questions, whatever, you ought to catch me on the fly somewhere outside of that. When we come back from our break, we'll get started then on the
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed hearing from Meredith Kline himself about the Incarnation. Granted, it was just a brief reference, but in that lecture, it provided him an analogy to compare the second person of the Trinity taking a human body to himself, a human nature to himself, gave him an analogy between that and the phenomenon of the Holy Spirit taking on a physical manifestation in this world, which he called Endoxation. And we even got to hear him use the phrase that inspired us to come up with the title for this podcast, The Glory Cloud. And I hope that you enjoyed hearing that. I'd also like to remind our listeners that that lecture is available on YouTube. I will link to it in the show notes, and you can find the show notes page at meredithkline.com/podcast. This was the 13th lecture that I posted on YouTube there. And so if you're interested to go back over the material that he was talking about, I have illustrations in the video. You can hear him writing on the chalkboard, and I try to illustrate some of what he's talking about in that lecture. So I refer you to that. And with that, I thank you for tuning in this week. Hope you have a great week, and be sure to send us your questions and comments at glorycloudpodcast@gmail.com, and we will see you again next week.